Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to this workshop on scalable solutions to mental health at EAGx Boston 2018. Let's see. Thank you. All right. Okay, so here's how this is gonna work. We're gonna start by playing a game called Guess the Impact. Some of you may have played this before at other EA presentations. And some of you may know the answers. So if you know the answer, don't shout it out, because that ruins it for everyone else. So we're gonna have a voting system, which I'll get you guys all set up on through your phones. And then we're gonna have breakout groups where you guys will get into small groups, like 3 people each, 3 or 4, and talk about ideas that you have or you're excited about for scalable solutions to mental health. Could be some organization that already exists that you're really passionate about. Could be some idea that you've been thinking about, or just could be something that you think of in this hour while we're here. And then the people who are most excited about their ideas, or if you think someone in your group has a really amazing idea, those people I want to have come up here and just share their ideas with the rest of the group, so that if there are other people in the group who are interested in collaborating or co-founding something, you can find each other here at EA Global. So. Why mental health? It's not a typical effective altruism cause area. So for those of you who are familiar with the 80,000 hours framework, they look for big, neglected, and tractable causes. And mental health is absolutely big. I think there's no debate about that. This estimate here is that it accounts for 13% of global disability-adjusted life years, and 32% of years lived with disability. It's one of the biggest categories of disease burden, probably after heart disease and a few other big ones. The other interesting thing about mental health is it directly impacts well-being, whereas something like physical pain may or may not cause you to suffer depending on how you interpret that pain and how you deal with that pain. But suffering is suffering, obviously. And you could have very good material circumstances, very good physical health, but if you have mental health, you could be suffering a lot even without pain. So that's why I like this poster here, no health without mental health. And then on neglectedness, mental health is very neglected, actually, especially when you look beyond developed countries. But even in developed countries, around 35 to 50% of people who have diagnosable mental health conditions don't actually get any treatment. Sometimes it's due to lack of funding, but often it's due to the difficulty reaching those people, and a lot of those people aren't ready to go out and access services themselves, and there's a lot of stigma around that and ways that we could reduce that gap. But in the developing world, there's very little access to treatment. There's way too few providers. So the gap is around 76 to 85% of people with diagnosable conditions don't get any treatment whatsoever. And one more point here on the neglectedness is this chart is showing how many disability-adjusted life years are lost due to HIV versus due to mental health. Mental health is actually bigger, twice as big as HIV. But when you look at how much spending goes into global development assistance for each of these, it's all going to HIV, basically. So it's a very neglected area. And then the last question about this, I'll send the slides out after also, if you guys want. So the last question is this a tractable area? And I think that's the question where a lot of people in the effective altruism community would say, it's not as tractable as something like malaria, where you just need to distribute more bed nets. And a lot of the interventions we have for mental health, like therapists, psychiatrists, require a lot of training. They're expensive people to hire. And there's such a huge treatment gap, we're never going to be able to triple or quadruple the number of psychiatrists and therapists, and that would cost a huge amount. So the question is, to make mental health a great cause area within effective altruism, we need to find a way to make mental health interventions scalable. So that's the theme of this talk and what I want you guys to really think about when you're working on your own ideas. So a little bit about me. My name is Gastfriend, and I got into effective altruism after I graduated from college. I was already into animal welfare and international development while I was in college. Got very interested reading works of Peter Singer and other philosophers. And I got introduced to 80,000 Hours after college and started volunteering with them, so that was the beginning of my involvement in the EA community. I ran a tech startup for 3 years called Happy Cloud, which is a cloud gaming startup, and went to Harvard Business School, where I started a grad student effective altruism club at Harvard across all the different grad schools. And now I have a tech startup called DynamiCare Health, which is building an app to help people recover from substance addiction, drugs, alcohol, tobacco. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And one thing I want to mention to people is part of what got me interested in mental health as an EA cause area is because I started a project within the EA club at Harvard called the Philanthropy Advisory Fellowship, where we recruit and train Harvard grad students from across all the different grad schools to advise philanthropists and foundations on how to have the greatest impact with their charitable dollars. We've done work for YouTube, Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, Laura John Arnold Foundation, TripAdvisor Foundation, a bunch of big names in the foundation space. And one of the projects we did was for a family foundation that was interested in mental health in sub-Saharan Africa. So we looked into a bunch of different interventions for them, things that they could fund. And that's what really got me started thinking about all these questions even before I started DynamiCare. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to start our game of Guess the Impact, and this will go about like 25, 30 minutes. I want you all to take out your phones and either enter in this URL or do a QR code scan if you know how to do that. And that way you'll be able to vote on, what you think the impact of each intervention is that I talk about. And for most of these, there's like a... Oh, wait,
Can you go back?
Yeah, sorry. For most of these, there is a right answer, which you'll see at the end. There's a couple where it's like more ambiguous. So the first one that we're doing, Guess the Impact number 1. It's a program called the Cambridge Somerville Youth Program. It was started in 1936. And the goal was to reduce juvenile delinquency. So they took at-risk kids who are aged 5 to 13, and they paired them up with counselors who are adults who kind of mentor them and role model for them. They did tutoring, they gave them access to medical and psychiatric care, all sorts of community programs like the YMCA, and they held summer camps for them. So I'd like you guys to, what's going on the survey thing right now? Okay.
By the way, that my phone made that all lowercase. If your phone, that's a case-sensitive URL.
It is?
So, yeah.
Thank
If
you
you're having
for
trouble
mentioning
getting that, you can just manually modify the end of that to be the correct capitalization.
Thank you.
All right, this is my test question. I've never done this before, so can you guys just...
I wonder if there's bias by showing the results in real time.
Yeah, I thought it wouldn't show the results in full time, but now I'm not sure how to make it. Also, I can't see which one is... Did you guys vote for Hambone or Flip It?
I was an early adopter of Hambone.
I'm Flippy. Guys, everyone, if you haven't voted, vote Flippy.
All right, well, Nate, I have bad news for you.
We go back to the URL just for a minute.
Thank you so much. I'll write it down.
There you
Not
go.
a problem.
Bad news for you, Nate. It's Hambone. All right, is everyone good with the URL now? All right. So y'all can start voting. I'm gonna hide the results. Try to hide the results. Looks like, oh. Looks like there's still, wow. There's a lot of voting going on. It's still happening. I thought it'd be done by now. Are people changing their answers? All right.
No, it
Yeah, I
was.
think you can.
Yeah.
Okay, the problem is I don't know what people voted for.
I think it's in order.
That's a big
It's in black text.
In order of what, though?
Like on the survey.
positive, neutral, negative.
Compare those to a show of hands.
There are a little over 50 people in this room.
Show of hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, so much for that. Okay, so,
The one problem is that might skew the votes if people want it to be like private. I guess like a better way to do it maybe is to say like everyone who's gonna vote positive, vote now, on your thing, and then like everyone who's gonna vote,
Oh, that's a good idea.
vote then because then no one will be, Does that make
Is there
sense?
a way to end the poll since just the names show up? Maybe that's the thing.
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I might do that.
There's a little square at the bottom. I'm just curious.
Oh, there we go. When I pause it. Oh, okay. So that's how it works.
Wow,
All
negative.
right, great. So, yeah, negative was the right answer. Let's see why. So most of you said positive.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so this was actually one of the first randomized controlled trials ever run on a social program, because this was back in 1936. So they took 506 kids who were eligible for the program, and they literally flipped a coin to decide whether each kid would get the program or not. And then they followed up with the kids for 30 years after the program to find out what happened in those people's lives. And they did surveys at N-line, which is when the intervention ended, 10 years after, and 30 years after. And they found that it increased criminality, alcoholism, mental health diagnoses, and stress-related diseases. The only area where it didn't score badly is that people loved the program. So the kids who went through it said it was like one of the best times of their life. The mentors who went through it said they love their kids, they think about their kids all the time. So, obviously this raises the question of why did it have this negative backfire effect? And the weird thing is randomized controlled trial, for all of its power and rigor, doesn't really answer that question of why it didn't work. So there's a few different hypotheses people have put forward. One is that maybe it raised the expectations of the kids for what they would be able to accomplish in their lives, and then they weren't able to meet those expectations, and that disappointed them. Another theory is that maybe in the summer camps where they had all these at-risk kids together, maybe they influenced, maybe they had a bad influence on each other somehow. Those are the two plausible explanations I've seen, but I think it's not something where anyone can give you a really good answer on it. All right, next one. Big brother, big sister. So I think most of you are pretty familiar with Big Brother, Big Sister. It's very similar. It's a mentoring program where people can volunteer, and I think people have to spend at least a year working with the little brother or little sister and see them like 2 to 4 times a month. So, okay, let's see. How do I get the poll to go to the next question? Can you guys vote now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. All right, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so neutral was the most neutral was the most common answer there, but the correct answer has a positive effect. So there are 2 randomized controlled trials. They both have 1.5-year follow-ups. And the first one had 950 kids, and the other one had over 1,000. So they're both like pretty large-scale randomized controlled trials, which is the best way to study the impacts of these programs. They both found improved academic performance in terms of like test scores and attendance at school. and the first one also found that kids were less likely to use drugs or alcohol and have better relationships with their family and community. So obviously this raises like a really interesting question of why does Big Brother Big Sister work when like Cambridge Somerville Youth Study, which is like so similar, have this like huge negative impact. One reason could be maybe it was like the summer camps of the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study that caused those negative impacts. Another answer might be, there might be lots of differences in how these programs are implemented, who's running them, who the mentors are, things like that, that led to these changes. Maybe it's a different population of kids. So, unfortunately, mental health is still a very poorly understood area, and I think using randomized controlled trials like this is the best way to get these answers, but we still don't have like a really strong theory of how this all fits together and what's going to work to help people, what won't. So welcome to the epistemological black hole. For those of you who aren't familiar with the word epistemological, it basically means how do we know what we think we know? How do we arrive at what the truth is? And sometimes you can get stuck in a situation where you think you know what's happening and everyone says that it's working, and really you could be totally wrong and it can be very, very hard to know. So hopefully this helps to get you all thinking more about the strength of evidence and skepticism around social impact. All right, next one is Scared Straight. So some of you might be familiar with this one already. This is a program where they take kids who are either at risk or have already offended juvenile crimes, and they take them to maximum security prisons, or they bring maximum security prison felon convicts to the juvenile detention to basically tell the kids about how terrible it is to live a life of crime and to be in jail for the rest of your life. And these convicted felons really have a huge impact on the kids in terms of impressing upon them like just how terrible and scary and not cool it is to end up living a life of crime. So there have been a bunch of randomized controlled trials on Scared Straight. There's actually a big documentary about it, which was aired on TV and very popular. So you guys can all vote now, right? Well, whatever the answer is, there seems to be a lot of consensus on this one. All right, 3, 2, 1. So most of you are correct. It had a pretty significant negative impact. So there was a meta-analysis of 9 random or quasi-random trials, and they concluded that it actively increases crime rates. It's so bad that every dollar spent on this program causes $203 in costs to society. And the crazy thing is that this program is still ongoing. A lot of people think that it works because they see the impact that it has on the kids, which is that the kids do get really scared of this life that's ahead of them, and kids will, even these really tough kids will break down crying and say, I never want to end up like that. Personally, I think the explanation for this is that the role model effect still exists, even though it's like a negative role model. Kids get kind of fed the expectation that this is what's going to happen to them, and that can unconsciously drive their behavior. Okay, so next one is another example around crime and role modeling, but takes a different approach. So this is a local charity in Liberia called Network for Empowerment and Progressive Initiative, NEPI. And they take former child soldiers and people who are kind of engaging in antisocial behavior, which is like living a life of crime on the streets, dealing drugs or con artistry, petty theft, and they use positive role modeling to teach them how to live a more productive life, even really basic stuff like this is how you dress properly, this is how you go into a store and buy something with money. They've been featured on Freakonomics, which is how I heard about them. And it's actually led by a local person who's a former child soldier from the Liberian Civil War who went and got his master's from Columbia. So, are you guys all voting? All right, 3, 2, 1. Positive and highly positive. Nice. So I put the answer as positive, but I mean, of course, it's kind of subjective. So there was a large randomized controlled trial on it run by Chris Blattman at Columbia, who's like one of the leading development economists on doing randomized controlled trials on things like this. And he found a large and sustained fall in criminal and antisocial behavior, lower impulsivity, and interestingly, increased income too. So they were better able to get jobs and provide for themselves. The program only cost around $718 per participant. Chris Blattman estimated that the program costs $21 for every crime prevented. So it's definitely pretty positive. I would say the distinction I'm trying to make between positive and highly positive is not just like kind of the size of the intervention, size of the effect, but also like how scalable and how many people it can affect. Does it affect hundreds of people or millions of people? And that's kind of what goes into my decision about what to call highly positive versus positive.
So quick question about the cost output, cost impact.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you mean by that? So it costs $178 for each participant and the impact is $21?
Yeah, because the a lot of the participants like would commit like crimes on a weekly basis. So if you get like one person to go away from a life of crime, then you spent like $720 on them, but you could prevent like 50 crimes from that one person. So that's why but the reason I distinguish between outputs and impact is output you could measure just from the like nonprofit's budget and how many people they say went through the program. That will tell you, like the output of cost per participant. But what you really want to know is like, did it actually reduce crime and what was the cost of reducing the crime? So that's where you need the randomized controlled trial for. One of the really interesting things about this is like, how do you measure like how many crimes someone is causing, right? You could look at arrest records, but most of the time they don't get arrested. You could do a survey, but are they telling the truth in the survey? So what Chris Blattman did is for like 10% he did a survey for everyone, but for like 10% of the participants, he hired people to stalk these guys like 24/7 and like watch them on the street to see if they were committing crimes. And it turned out that the like stalker data and the self-report data ended up being like roughly the same. So they were actually reporting their own crimes accurately.
Is it possible that they were aware of someone watching them, like at the time? Like the stalker?
Yeah, but then what happens is like you look at the people who are being watched versus the people who just did the self-report, and I think the data was roughly the same across the two groups, so it probably didn't have an impact there. I know there's like a lot of questions, but we have a lot of guessed impacts.
Just a quick
Oh, yeah.
comment. Like this guy's like Batman. I mean, his last name is like with the like prevention of crime. I'm pretty good about that.
That comment was worth it, for sure. Okay, next one. This is a nonprofit, another local nonprofit based in Sierra Leone called Famble Talk. And it's in the one of the local languages in Sierra Leone. It means basically like family talk. And Sierra Leone was racked by a really horrific civil war where there were a lot of crimes against humanity committed by local people from different tribes or ethnic groups against each other. And there was a national reconciliation process, but it was very limited and only in the capital city, and there was all this stuff that happened that didn't really get dealt with in any official way. So Famble Talk was started by a human rights organizer to try to have local truth and reconciliation processes based on local culture, using like bonfires and all sorts of things from the culture with the buy-in from the community leaders, where they would have people who are living in a community where some people committed horrific atrocities against other people in that community during the Civil War, and they would come and talk about what happened and come to some process of forgiving each other so that they can go on living in peace. So I think you guys can vote for it now, right? So start your voting.
What's the outcome metric for this?
So there's a few outcome metrics. The one that I'm going to use is the outcomes on mental health. So measures of mental health like depression, anxiety, PTSD, stuff like that. But there were some other ones that they measured in the RCT. All right. Oh, well, it's like all across the board here. That's really interesting. All right, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so most people voted positive. Unfortunately, it was negative. So let's talk about that. So the Poverty Action Lab at MIT did a randomized controlled trial of 200 villages. So this is called like a cluster randomized controlled trial where you can't randomize each individual person, but you can randomize clusters of people like a village or a school. So as I mentioned, they looked at multiple outcome metrics. On some metrics, it was positive. So it did strengthen community trust and social ties in the community. So people did trust each other more. They did forgive each other. That part of it did work. However, on the mental health side of things, it increased anxiety, depression, and PTSD scores pretty significantly by 36 to 47%. And these effects persisted for 3 years. So it seems like the lesson to take away from this is that people might have been better off just not reopening all these old wounds from the war and just trying to get on with their lives without thinking about it as much. And the interesting thing is, I think that this organization is still running. Like the website is still up, they still take donations and things like that. So I don't know if they've changed the program because of this RCT or what changes they've made, but just something to keep in mind. Like, you know, with Scared Straight, also sometimes the evidence doesn't change people's minds.
When were these metrics gotten? After like a year? How many?
I think they probably did like shortly after the intervention and then for a 3-year follow-up.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, next one, Friendship Bench. So this is an organization started by a psychiatrist in Zimbabwe. And what they do is they train grandmas, literally grandmas, to do talk therapy with people who are suffering from depression or anxiety. A lot of it is women suffering from depression. A lot of times it's postpartum depression. Because there's just not enough like professional mental health services like psychiatrists, therapists, to be able to treat everyone. And this psychiatrist was like very frustrated that he couldn't talk to all these people who needed help. So he started training grandmas to literally sit on a bench, which they call the friendship bench, and anyone can come and talk to them and get help with whatever it is they're going through. So I think you can all start voting now. Whoa, there's like a consensus on this one, but I don't know what the consensus is. All right, 3, 2, 1. Positive, great. Yes, finally, positive. So they did another cluster randomized controlled trial. They randomized at the clinic level. So they had 23 clinics participating in the study, 573 patients. Half of the clinics were told to send patients to the friendship bench. Half of them were told just to monitor the patients and follow up with them. And it had a pretty good impact on reducing signs of depression. So in the control group who didn't get the friendship bench, when they followed up with them, 50% still showed signs of depression 6 months after leaving the clinic. Whereas for the ones who were sent to the friendship bench, only 14% showed signs of depression. So it's pretty big impact. So apparently, grandmas are like just as good at doing therapy as a lot of trained professionals, maybe even better. Yeah.
You think it's the one-to-one kind of aspect of the positive ones? I mean, from what this like kind of group of data shows is that like the first one, the Somerville one, was more like many youth, many counselors, so it didn't seem like it was one-to-one. Even I would posit that Scared Straight is actually like many, because you have multiple felons kind of yelling at the kid, oh, blah 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 blah, and then the community one in Sierra Leone also happens to be a bunch of people, but the two successful ones so far seem to involve kind of a one-to-one. Do you think that?
I don't think you can generalize like that, because I mean, if I could do more, guess the impacts, I'd do more, but there's one not included here. There's an organization called Strong Minds, which is also based in Africa, and they do group interpersonal therapy. And that one has really good impacts also. So I think it's more complicated. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, next one. Oh. Louisa, do you want to say anything about Friendship Bench?
Sure. I'm working on the evaluation of a rural scale-up of the Friendship Bench right now. So basically, the study that's being cited here was like a highly controlled randomized control trial where the environment was very closely monitored, but what a lot of data from other primary care mental health scale-ups in Africa shows that sort of when you take things to scale in rural areas that have different resources and different cultural perceptions of mental illness, efficacy and implementation can really just fail. So we are now studying like the efficacy of a rural scale-up of the Friendship Bench. So we'll see if it works, or if it doesn't, what modifications need to be made to make it more effective.
That's awesome. Sorry, I know there's a bunch of questions, but I'm worried we might run out of time. And actually, let me see. This ends at 2:25, right?
Yeah, you have 10 minutes. Ask the schedule.
Oh, we're 10 minutes behind?
Yeah, we're right down.
So I have until 2:35?
No. On the schedule is 2:15, so you have until.
Oh, I do have until 2:25. Okay. All right. I think I'm going to skip this one. It's not as interesting. All right. Let's do this one. Iodine fortification. So iodine is a necessary nutrient for healthy brain function and development. That's like very well known, very well established science. When you have a deficiency, it causes a disease called goiter, which is an inflammation of the thyroid. It can also cause something called cretinism, which is basically a form of stunting. And the picture here is a man who suffered from that. So I think you only grow to like 3 feet or something. And when your mom was pregnant, if she had a deficiency in iodine, it can cause that. So it can cause all sorts of like developmental brain development delays and problems if you have iodine deficiency. The one potential problem, so the idea of how to deal with this is to fortify salt with iodine. You can just add iodine to salt, it doesn't really affect the taste. Very easy to do, and everyone eats salt. So the one fear people had about it is if you have a sudden increase in iodine intake, it can cause hyperthyroidism, which can be deadly. So I want to play guess the impact on this one. When they started introducing iodine salt in the US, what was the impact? Three, 2, 1. Oh, great. It was hugely positive. So, and this one might be a more well-known example to you guys. So there's been a bunch of different studies on this, and it's hard to know exactly what the impact was because we don't really have randomized controlled trials, but the impact seems to have made the intervention seems to have made a huge impact. There's one study that estimated that iodine fortification raised IQ scores by 15 points for 50 million people. And that's probably a high estimate. Most of the estimates are lower than that. GiveWell estimates that today it costs around 6 cents per person per year and gives an average IQ increase of 6 points per child. So there was probably some increase in death from hyperthyroidism, but it's really, really small, so like 2 or 3 deaths per 100,000 people, which is like 1,000th of a %. Oh, and this is a really cool chart comparing the cost effectiveness of iodine fortification to some other popular interventions in the EA world. So it compares iodine to some other nutrient interventions, but also compares it to against Malaria Foundation. So the interesting thing here is, iodine is impacting brain development, so they categorize it as mental health. Against Malaria Foundation is mainly physical health and preventing death. They put like a small amount of credit for mental health for AMF because you can get cerebral malaria, which can cause all sorts of brain problems, although it's pretty rare. The interesting thing is that this iodine fortification is so cost effective even compared to some of these other things that are like best things in EA. Although, and even better than like Strong Minds, which is interpersonal group therapy, which is actually really effective. So one thing though, just to be fair to Against Malaria Foundation is the way that they calculated this, it's not like taking into account the parent's mental health of like losing a child. So I think there'd be a big impact from that too. But just really interesting to get a sense of this scale here. Okay, next one, leaded gasoline ban. So this is kind of similar to the iodine thing. We know that lead is bad for brain development and lowers IQ. We know that there used to be a lot of lead in gasoline, and then so cars would run on gasoline, burn lead would go in the atmosphere. So then the question is, if you ban lead from gasoline, what is the impact going to be on brain development in children and measures of mental health? So you can start voting. Three, two, one. Hugely positive. Great. So you guys probably knew this one already. I think still like how hugely positive it was is like really surprising. So we don't have like randomized controlled trials on this. It's not that kind of thing, but we do have like pretty strong evidence from the US, but also from like many countries around the world that have implemented bans on leaded gasoline. And the chart on the left is showing the link between gasoline, lead, and violent crime. So the way that these charts work is there's like a 23-year lag between when you ban lead and gasoline and when the impact happens, because a lot of the impact of lead comes from early childhood, even like pregnancy. So you have to wait a long time before you see the effects. But if you create that time lag, the charts match up really nicely. So this is still like correlational data, but you see this pattern in many, many countries. So there's a huge spike in the 90s of violent crime, and no one knew what caused it or what made it go away. I think like Rudy Giuliani and New York Police Department got a lot of credit for making the crime spike go away, but it seems like the leaded gasoline ban had a much, much bigger effect. Teen pregnancy, same thing, and then the chart on the right is showing the link between blood lead level and IQ. And as you have more and more lead in your blood, hurts IQ, hurts brain development and function. Okay, next one is pesticide regulations in Sri Lanka. This is an interesting one. So in Sri Lanka and South Asia, generally India, one of the most common forms of suicide is to consume highly toxic pesticides. So the question is, if you just ban the most toxic forms of pesticide, what impact will that have on suicide rates? So, okay, you should be able to start voting now. Oh wow, this is all across the board. All right, 3, 2, 1. Hugely positive, yes. So it's interesting, there's a big spread there. What happened in Sri Lanka? So this is a study of just kind of charting the plot of suicide deaths compared to when these bans went into place. I have a laser pointer. Does this work? Oh, wow. Okay, so there's a ban here, but it wasn't like really the most toxic forms. This is when they started banning the most toxic chemicals, and then this is when they banned another one. And you see it correlated with a huge decrease in deaths from self-poisoning. So that at least strongly implies that it reduced suicides. And even though there was like a small increase in some other types of suicides, it was not at all offset by that increase. So the overall suicide rate went way down. And maybe there could have been some external factor that made suicides go down. But the interesting thing is that in India, where they didn't implement a pesticide ban, India saw a similar increase in suicides around here, and then it just stayed high. So they didn't get that drop in suicides that Sri Lanka got. So the evidence is pretty good that this was hugely positive for the overall suicide rate in the country. All right, I think I only have 15 minutes left. All right, so I think probably most of you know that DARE was not effective. So we'll just skip the game for that one. The sad thing is that it was scaled up massively to 75% of school districts. 15,000 police officers were involved running this program that basically had no effect on drug use after 30 studies. Okay, so they changed the program. They rebranded it, keeping it real, and instead of trying to scare kids about the harms of drugs, they tried to teach kids skills for how to deal with it if their friends are doing drugs and they don't want to do drugs, and try to teach kids some communication skills, things like that. So it was a very different program built from the ground up with input from researchers who studied cognitive behavioral therapy and prevention programs for youth. So I want you guys to vote on this one. Three, two, one. Positive, yeah. So, to their credit, DARE really took the criticism seriously, brought in a lot of researchers, redid the whole program, did a new RCT, and it seems to have had pretty good effects. It improved norms and attitudes around drug use, and 1 in 10 kids who were using alcohol when the program started quit alcohol, and that is counterfactually adjusted compared to the control group. It didn't have a big impact on tobacco or marijuana use. Controversial one, Alcoholics Anonymous. I think you guys know what it is. This is a self-help group all around the world of people addicted to alcohol or other drugs who help people, and it's centered around this book, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So let's just vote on that one. I think most of you probably know roughly what it is. Three, two, one. Positive. Oh, tied between positive and neutral. That's cool. So, it's really hard to study AA because it's a self-help group that anyone can go to. So what they try to do, and there have only been a couple randomized controlled trials that have even tried to study AA, but what you try to do is tell half the people to go to AA and tell the other half not to go, but you don't really have any control whether they go or don't. Some people who you told not to go will go, and some people who you told to go won't go. So they have tried to do some statistical techniques to tease apart this crossover effect, and I don't even understand how all these statistical techniques work, but this is the most rigorous study that I could find on this question, which found a genuine AA treatment effect that going to an additional 2 AA meetings per week produced at least 3 more days of alcohol abstinence per month, which is pretty good. All right, next one is alcohol tax. So these are some numbers from the CDC showing that one drink leads to $2 in economic cost to society. Obviously, the alcohol tax that we currently have is much lower than that. And most of these costs come from binge drinking. So if a government increases the size of the alcohol tax, what impact do you expect to have on measures of binge drinking? Three, 2, 1. Hugely positive is the correct answer. Most people said positive or neutral. So GiveWell did a huge study looking into this where they actually tried to replicate the data and analysis that had gone into previous studies. And GiveWell concluded that a 1% price increase reduces drinking by 0.5% and reduces death by 1 to 3%. Because actually the alcohol tax is more expensive for binge drinkers because they drink so frequently. So it reduces binge drinking more than it reduces regular drinking. And GiveWell estimated that a 10% price increase in the cost of alcohol would save 2,000 to 6,000 lives in the US. Unfortunately, this chart shows that the effective taxes on alcohol have gone down a lot since the 50s and 60s. So alcohol taxes are basically the lowest point now than they've been in recent history in the US, unfortunately. Okay, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I think I'm gonna end the guessing part. I just wanted to point out a few things. Everyone guess in your mind about financial incentives for sobriety. So basically paying people to stay sober or to stay in treatment. Could be cash or vouchers. So the answer is positive. This is actually very well studied methodology. Over 100 randomized controlled trials and 7 meta-analyses have shown that you can improve outcomes in addiction treatment by providing rewards combined with monitoring for staying sober and staying in treatment. So this is actually the concept that I based my company on. It's called DynamiCare Health. And we have a system for doing drug testing through the phone tied to rewards on a reloadable debit card so that we can get this evidence-based practice out to many more people. And it's a hugely neglected intervention, even though it's one of the things we have the most evidence for within addiction treatment, it hardly gets used. So our company is hoping to change that. And I would say effective altruism and this framework of looking for big, neglected, tractable problems was a big influence on me to choose this as a startup to do, because I realized this was a big and tractable problem, but a hugely neglected potential solution. So computerized CBT, I think most of you know it's very well established that cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most effective interventions for treating depression. The interesting thing is, could you make it more scalable by putting it into a self-help computer program, whether it's an app or a website? And there are a few companies trying to do this, including this one called Uplift, which is founded by an effective altruist named Spencer Greenberg. And it's a really awesome project, which hopefully will get a lot more adoption. And it's great that people in the EA community are working on this kind of thing. So with that, I think I'm going to skip all the other stuff and go straight to the workshop. So we've only got like 7 or 8 minutes left. But for a few minutes, can you talk to the people who are sitting near you about any ideas that you have that you're excited about? And after a few minutes, we'll invite whoever wants to share to come up and share their ideas.
Hello. We were thinking about ways to improve sleep quality on a population level, because that seems to have a pretty strong correlation with mental health. I think one of my group members mentioned that distributing like non-pharmacological sleep aids to people sleeping in well-lit areas like masks or white noise generators or earplugs could really help them sleep. But if anyone has ideas on just like ways to improve sleep quality on a population level, you could have like a pretty substantial impact on mental health.
Great. Oh, and say your name?
Hi, I'm Louisa.
So come speak to Louisa if you're interested. Great.
Hey, I'm John Stewart. My idea isn't that creative. It's just bringing these mental health solutions, these apps that teach you cognitive therapy techniques, bringing them to large institutions and offering to give them a discount if they provide it to their students. If you organize it the right way, if you structure it the right way, it could be that the university doesn't have to pay anything, and you could, by doing that, get access to many more people. So this has been a side project, like an idea of mine I haven't gotten to yet. If other people have the energy, the time, and the skill set for it, then I'm happy to talk about it and move forward. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrew Zuckerman. I'm a student at Harvard, and on Tuesday, I'm planning a day for the student body to unplug from their cell phones. So I think it took a very little amount of time to organize, and I think it's going to be like a hugely good thing for the community. I'm curious, like, what data to collect to see how this changes like long-term behavior. But if you're interested in like bringing this to your own community, there's a group called National Day of Unplugging that they'll like help you get set up, and it takes like a small amount of time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lexi Mills. I'm primarily an algorithm specialist working online, and I've been tracking my mother's search behavior for about 5-6 years.
Consensually?
No, but she was thinking about it, and she needs me to operate a machine. But what I noticed is she's manic, and I've been able to predict when she's having a manic episode by seeing changes in her behaviors. Now, it's not specific searches, it's a change in her own personal pattern. And I've just started scaling it up to bipolar and schizophrenia. And the interesting thing is, if someone's had medical treatment for a long period of time and not cleared their cache, we can back correlate it and then model it forward. So you can start to send out alerts when someone's showing micro changes instead of waiting for a big crash, because it's not just about coming back from the crash itself is quite distressing. Yeah, so that's how
All right, thank you guys all so much for coming. If you want to reach me, I'll stand out here and I'll give out like business cards, and I might write my email, so you can all feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.